Everyone. So today we will be looking at some research methods that we have within developmental psychology. One of the first things that we will do when we do that is we will look at some data collection procedures that we have that we often use when we're talking about developmental psychology. So we have this table in front of us which shows us all of these different methods. This is also available in your book. One of the first ways that we collect data is through observation, right? Now, that means that we just observe someone's behavior, right? Now, there can be two different kinds of observation, right? One is what we call naturalistic observation. The other is what we call more structured observation. Now, let's look at what the differences are between these. So, naturalistic observation is observation that occurs in a natural context. So for example, if I were to call in let's suppose an observer in our class, and that individual was to observe your behavior, right? So that would be your natural setting because you all come to class anyway, right? Or if there was someone who was going to be observing you in, let's suppose, while in the FCC's ground or cafe, while you interact with your friends, right? Or, you, for example, in a lab while you study, right? So all of these settings would be natural settings, right? And you would have done all of this even if this observation was not taking place, right? So naturalistic observation occurs in naturalistic settings, right? Versus more structured observation. When we talk about structured observation always happens in a controlled setting, right? So if you go back to this, what you see is that it's observation of behavior in a lab, right? Which conditions, for which the conditions are the same for all participants, right? So for example, you set up some kind of situation in a lab, right? For example, when we talk about attachment theory, right? So in attachment theory, when we do these experiments with children, right, and their mothers, right, we are observing them in a lab setting. We have created a situation in which we are observing them, right? So if, for example, I set up, a particular situation in a class, right? A particular learning situation, let's suppose, and I do it to study how well you're able to learn or how you react, and there's an observer observing your behavior, that would be more of a structured observation, right? Now, let's look at the relative strengths and limitations of each of these. So, in naturalistic observation, you have a reflection of, people's everyday life. However, in structured observation, you have, every participant being given an equal opportunity to display the behavior that we have in question, the phenomena that we have in question, right? So, for example, when we talk about the strain situation, this is something that we'll talk about at greater length in the subsequent chapters. But, when we talk about how you bring in a child inside a lab and you observe how they behave, every child has an equal opportunity to behave in a particular manner, right? So that's what we're looking at when we're looking at the strengths. If you talk about the limitations, right? Obviously, in naturalistic settings, when you're observing, people in their natural settings, you have no control over the situation. They can observe in an infinite number of ways. You have nothing, you cannot control that situation. There are so many different factors that might be at play. Whereas in structured observation, you still have more control over what goes on, right? Because obviously this is a lab setting. This is a situation that you have created. Make sense, right? All right, so this was with regards to the observation part, right? Let's look at self-reports as a method of data collection, right? When we talk about self-reports, we have two different kinds of methods here. One is what we call the clinical interview, right? And the other is what we call the structured interview, and which can also include questionnaires and tests, right? Now, again, when we talk about a clinical interview, right? what is the difference between clinical interviews and more structured interviews, right? The difference is quite similar to what we have with regards to naturalistic observation and more, you know, more structured observation. In a clinical interview, you have a flexible style of interviewing, right? So, for example, if you ask a question in an interview, right, and your interviewee gives you a particular response, what you do is that you frame your next question according to that. Does that make sense? Right? Let me give you an example of this. So here we have this particular bit from an interview that Jean Piaget, we've already looked at his cognitive developmental theory. He was conducting with, this child, a 5-year-old child, and he was asking him about dreams, trying to assess his understanding of dreams. So he says, "Where does the dream come from?" Right? And the child says, "I think you sleep so well that you dream." And then Piaget, the next question he asks is, "Does it come from us or from outside?" Right? And then the child says, "From outside." And then Piaget says, "When you are in bed and you dream, where is the dream?" Right? And the child says, "In my bed, under the blanket. I don't really know. If it was in my stomach, the bones would be in the way and I shouldn't see it." And then Piaget is sort of structuring his questions according to the child's answers, right? This is what a clinical interview basically is, that you have a very, very flexible style of interviewing, right? In contrast to this, when you look at a structured interview, right? A structured interview is that you already have, a list of questions, and you're going to ask those questions in the same sort of format, no matter what the answers are going to be, right? So you already have devised, let's suppose, a questionnaire, right? And that's what you're going to be using in order to, sort of get your responses, right? So let's suppose you've already created a list. If you're asking someone about dreams, you've created a list. What is a dream, right? Um, let's suppose. And the next question is, how would you describe your dreams? So the list goes on, but you do not change the order of the questions or the questions themselves because of the responses that your respondent gives you, right? That's the most important bit here, right? And, obviously, I'm sure all of you have taken certain, sort of questionnaires and tests online, surveys you filled up, right? So you would know how this works, right? And obviously, in a clinical interview, the strength is that it comes as close as possible to the way participants think in everyday life, right? You get to really understanding how they think about a phenomena because you're interviewing them in so much depth, right? However, in a questionnaire, the strength is that you get to compare participants' responses. क्योंकि जब एक, when we have a clinical interview, you will not have the ability to compare people's responses because they will be so different from one another, right? However, in a questionnaire, because every question is the same, every question has perhaps only, so many options that you can choose a response from. So, you will be able to compare the responses from across participants. That's something that you cannot do in a clinical interview. The limitation then of a clinical interview is that it may not result in accurate reporting of information because, again, you have this very, very flexible style. So, it might not be something that you can quantify. A structured interview limitation is that it does not obviously have the same depth of information as a clinical interview, right? Okay, now we move on to clinical or case study methods, right? Um, Now, this method is something that, for example, you have one person that you're working with. Let's suppose, this person is a genius, right? Or that this person has some very rare developmental disorder, right? And you're very interested in studying what their development looks like, right? So you're looking at one individual psychological functioning, right? And you're using a variety of different data collection methods. So, for example, you might be interviewing them, you might be observing them, and at the same time, you might be administering them questionnaires, right? So you're using a variety of different research methods to study, in depth this one individual, right? Obviously, the strength of this is that you will get very rich, descriptive, detailed data into, this particular individual's development, right? However, the limitation is that you might have a particular theoretical preference. For example, when we consider the theories that we've seen, you might have a particular attachment to cognitive developmental theory, right? Piaget's cognitive developmental theory. And because of that, you might be biased in how you view this person, in how, you approach whatever it is that they're telling you, right? So that is something that can be a limitation, right? Last but not the least, we come to looking at ethnography. I'm not sure if you guys have heard about ethnography before this, but basically, an ethnography usually, is classically was considered a study of cultures, right? And because it existed within, mostly anthropology. However, it's also used within developmental psychology. It's when, when you look at the picture here, it's this Western researcher, right, studying this particular group of indigenous individuals, right? And look, for example, he's sitting there observing children, taking his notes, right? So basically, ethnography involves a very, very long term association with the people that you're studying, right? That's one of the first things that you have, right? And so this researcher is spending months living amongst these individuals that he's studying, right? Also, if you look at the definitions here, right? So you have participant observation of a culture. Basically, what that means is that you live within that culture, you participate within that culture, right? And you make extremely detailed field notes, right? The strength obviously is that you get a very, very detailed insight into the workings of this culture. However, again, the limitation is because you have one researcher working here. Again, you might have some kind of bias, you might have some kind of, sort of the individuals, the researchers' own theoretical preferences coloring the way that they see the phenomena, right? So yes, this is a bit about the different research methods that we have. Now we're going to be looking at more specific research methods in the sense that what is it that we use within developmental psychology. Now, I'm sure that studying quantitative research methods, all of you have heard about correlational research, right? And you've also heard about experimental research, right? So I'm not going to go over these in a lot of detail, but just as a sake of a review, I'm going to just tell you what the differences between these are. So for correlational research, right, you usually are trying to understand a relationship between two or more variables, right? So you're trying to see, for example, let's suppose, what is the relationship between self-esteem, right? And let's suppose the sort of parental practices that you have. Okay, so if your parents, let's suppose, practice this parental practice called authoritarian parenting, what happens to your self-esteem? How is your self-esteem going to be affected by it, right? However, the thing is, in a correlational research, right, you are only looking at the relationship. You're not going to ever be making any conclusions about what is affecting what, right? You cannot, using a correlational research design, you cannot say that a particular parental practice is causing these changes in self-esteem, right? All you can say is that these seem to be related, all right? Because you're not controlling either of the variables, right? Therefore, you cannot make conclusions about causation, right? About what variable causes another. All you can say is that two variables are related, right? You can say whether they are positively related. So if one changes, does the other change as well, right? That's something that you can talk about, right? Perhaps self-esteem and parental practice is not such a good example here. Let me revise this example. So let's suppose that you're trying to look at the relationship between self-esteem and academic achievement. right? So how well a person is doing in school and if that's related to their self-esteem, right? So if there would be a positive correlation between this, right? So what you would see is that as self-esteem would increase, academic achievement would also increase if there was a positive correlation, right? So we say that they're changing together, right? If, however, we saw that self-esteem was increasing, right? However, academic achievement was decreasing. What does that show us? That shows us that there is a negative relationship. As one variable increases, the other decreases, right? If we saw that if self-esteem increased, there was no change in academic achievement, or if academic achievement increased, there was no change in self-esteem. What we see then is that there is a zero relationship in the sense that these variables do not play any role. They do not share any relationship with one another. All right. However, when we talk about a negative relationship, that if one is increasing, the other is decreasing, that is still a relationship. Does that make sense? Because as one increases, the other decreases, right? Let's consider other variables. Let's suppose we have something like familial support, right? The support that you get from your family, right? And you have depressive symptoms, right? In children or adolescents, let's suppose, right? And let's suppose you find a relationship that as familial support increases, depressive symptoms in individuals decrease. Now, that is still a relationship, right? That still tells you that familial support and depressive symptoms in adolescents are related. Do you see that? So, a negative relationship is still a relationship, right? It just shows you the direction of the relationship, right?